Hey everybody, this is Hank Nelson, History Hank. I am extremely excited because this is my very first podcast, and for most of you, this is your first chapter in AP European history, unless you're insane and you just like listening to history, like I do. And this is chapter 13, The Renaissance, also known as one of the most boring chapters in AP Euro. So if you can get through this, you will love AP European history. Now, the word Renaissance is French for rebirth. That is because all the Renaissance philosophers fancied that they had created this whole new epoch of time, and that they were bringing back everything that the Romans and the Greeks had invented and all the stupid Middle Age people had lost. Now, the Middle Ages, we find out now, was actually developing these beliefs, these better economic systems, better political developments, and that is why the Renaissance was able to happen. You'll see in the Renaissance that the art is more realistic. It's not like in the Middle Ages where you see things that suck, like a person being the size of a castle in paintings. You'll see that the people are more individualistic and secular, and you'll see that the ideas that they hold dear are not so much based on the Bible as they are based on humanism. This time period is 14th to 16th century, and now we're going to get started on our first place of interest, which is Florence. Now, Florence is in central Italy, and during the Middle Ages, it became one of the most wealthy areas in southern Europe. It was basically the Beverly Hills of its day. Now, the people were dying of plague. There were bloated bodies lying in the streets, but at least the wealthy were, making a good living. The way they did this was they lent all of their money to the Pope and to the princes, who were starting to lose some of their power, lose a little bit of their wealth during the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. By doing this, they basically had the Pope in their pocket. And the Pope was one of the wealthiest people in Europe at the time. And so they were able to better their wealth as bankers and in commerce by lending money to the Pope. They also were very involved in the wool industry. They would buy their wool from England and Spain, this cheap wool, and they'd make it into wonderful cloth, probably the best cloth in Europe. And so they were able to sell this cloth, and the wealthy families, who were called oligarchs, were able to become some of the wealthiest people in Europe. The most well-known of these families, the rulers of Florence, were the de Medicis. Now, the de Medicis, as I said, were oligarchs. An oligarchy is where this group of wealthy merchants, or salesmen basically, traders, were able to seize control of a city from the nobles and control it. They were not the only form of politics, however. There were also the signori, which were their nastier counterparts in much of northern Italy. They controlled Venice, Milan, other cities in the north. And the signori were basically dictators. They were ruthless, corrupt, they were pretty bad guys. The oligarchies were a little bit better. They were more interested in intellectual things. They were more interested in the arts. And the de Medicis were the most famous, and they were the rulers of Florence. There was also the Popolo, which deserves to be mentioned here because it's one of the first of the many revolutions we're going to talk about in AP Euro. AP Euro is just full of revolutions. I mean, every page, basically, there's a revolution. So the Popolo were the poor folks, basically. They didn't have the vote. They were taxed. They were angry. They had no say in anything. So basically, they used assassination, guerrilla warfare to take over many of these city-states. They set up republican governments. They basically pretended like they were going to care for the common people. And do you think they did? Of course not. I mean, of course, right when they seize power, they exclude every class below them, just like the signori and the oligarchies did before them. So almost immediately, they're overthrown, and the despots or the merchants are brought back to replace them. Now, let's talk about the 5 major city-states. There was Venice in the northeast, and they were involved in trade, colonies. They basically controlled most of Western Asia and Eastern Europe. There was Milan, which was controlled by the Sforza family, who were probably some of the worst despots in Italy at the time, which made them a great power because despots, of course, have some of the strongest militaries. There was Florence, which we already said was controlled by the Medicis. Then there were the Papal States, who you can guess were controlled by the Pope. And there was Naples, which was in southern Italy and owned Sicily, which was a great trading spot as well. These Italian city-states continuously fought over the smaller city-states, which is kind of ironic. It would be like having two bullies on the playground fight for one little kid so they can take his lunch money. That's basically what they did, because they just milked these little city-states for all they were worth. But no one ever got control of too much, because every time one of these city-states would try to take too many of these smaller city-states, the other four would turn on it and fight it and make it stop. This is what's called modern diplomacy now, because it's diplomacy used to make sure that everything is peaceful and that no one becomes too powerful. The only problem with this form of diplomacy was it basically made Italy the whipping boy of Europe, because Italy had so much wealth but very little military force, very little unity. So you have France invading Italy in 1494, and then Germany comes in and says, no, France isn't going to take Italy, I want Italy. And so you have the French and the Germans fighting each other on Italian soil, which sucks for the Italians because they have all the hard stuff of the war. They lose economic power, their people are killed off. So that's basically the state of politics in the city-states. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the literature and the ideas of the Renaissance. These Italians knew that they were opening up this new period in Europe, this period of enlightenment. This guy Petrarch, who was probably the first person to see that the Renaissance was happening, he's called the father of humanism. Humanism is basically the idea that you must study Greek and Latin works in order to better your lives and to better society. The literature at the time showed that the individual was more prized than ever. In the medieval days, individual didn't mean crap unless you were the king. Now there were people like Alberti and Cellini who were writing their autobiographies. I think Alberti was the guy who went so far in his autobiography to talk about how he cried when his dog died because he wanted to show his sensitivity. These guys were pompous, they were arrogant, they wanted to show that they were the best. And the people loved them because they exemplified what we now call the Renaissance man, the man who can do anything. He's an athlete, he's a scholar, he's a ladies' man, he gets all the ladies. And so this was really the first time that people were writing these autobiographies boasting of themselves, and it really showed the individual spirit of the day. These people, they believed that you needed to have this thing called virtue, which meant that the man knew what he was doing, he knew who he was, he knew that he could excel in everything that he tried. It was a quest for glory, as they say. If you were involved, you were the most popular guy around. And you had to be smart, you had to study, you had to study letters, you had to study languages, you had to study philosophy and history. Those were some of the most important classes to learn at the time. And here's one of the most interesting things about the Renaissance, really. It's that these Renaissance humanists, as they're called, drifted away a little bit from Christianity. They were still devoutly Christian and devoutly Catholic, but they didn't believe that the Bible was the sole means of learning. They were studying these pagans, these, heathens, as the Catholic Church would think of them, from Greek and Rome. And they that was considered to be the way to reach enlightenment. But of course, whenever these heathens said anything that was in opposition to Christianity, it was basically thrown in the garbage because they wanted harmony between Christianity and these pagan beliefs. And if you're thinking right now, hey, what was the Pope doing when all this was going on? He must have been going crazy. He must have been tearing his hair out. Actually, no. The popes were some of the most secular people around. Many of them were corrupt. There was one guy, Leo X, probably my favorite pope from this time. He was the patron of Michelangelo. He purchased all the art of the greatest artists of the time. Very secular. And in fact, the day he was inaugurated into his position, he had been partaking in some sexy time the night before and had to be carried into the church on a bed because he couldn't stand up because he was in so much pain. He was so sore. So that's basically what the popes were like during this time. They were basically hypocrites. You think of the popes now as this guy just rides around the Pope mobile, wears his little hat, waves at people, a pretty pious guy. Back in the day, back in the Renaissance, these popes, they weren't waving from a Pope mobile, they were riding on a horse with a sword. Many of these popes were known as warrior popes because whenever the papal states were threatened, or whenever the papal states wanted to take a new territory, the Pope would be the one leading the charge. So very hypocritical, when the Pope's killing people. I think that's kind of bad. There's another Pope who, after he died, they convicted him of upwards of 50 charges, including piracy, sodomy, rape, bestiality, all sorts of terrible things. So, the popes at this time were pretty corrupt, but at the same time, it was so important that they were secular, that they were a little corrupt to this Renaissance, because all of the other wealthy people in Italy at this time were purchasing art for the first time ever. Wealthy people, not kings, not the churches, were purchasing art, mostly to glorify themselves. They had portraits made, statues carved, and a lot of religious paintings as well, and statues. The statue of David was created at this time by Michelangelo for the wool merchants in Florence. So it was extremely important that the popes, like Pope Leo X, granted, yes, he did partake in some lewd acts, but at the same time, he was the guy who had the famous Sistine Chapel in Rome painted. So it was important for this secularization because this brought about a whole new social status for the artists in Italy. Before, the artists were just these nameless monks hired out to paint in a book, paint a painting. Their names were never known. We don't know most of the artists from the medieval ages because they were so unimportant. At this time, the artists were seen as almost divine because they were so talented. People thought they were like gods. Michelangelo himself was seen as almost like a descendant of God because he was such a prince of culture. At the same time, though, sadly, the working class, the peasants, poor people, they never saw any of this work. They didn't even know this was going on. If they had enough money to put bread on the table, that's all they cared about. So this Renaissance was exclusively for the wealthiest class, for the ruling class. Literature at this time finally branched out of this religious stage. Castiglione, he wrote The Courtier, which basically said, hey guys, if you act like this, you'll be successful in life and you will get women. He told the upperclassmen they had to be academic, they should be able to write poetry, they should be athletic. And again, this was the idea of the Renaissance man. Da Vinci was the most famous Renaissance man. The guy did everything. He even invented like a helicopter 400 years before it was invented, 500 years before it was invented. The guy was insane. The other really famous book at this time was The Prince, which was written by Machiavelli. It's still read today by most presidents. That's why I can understand we're always at war in this country. Anyway, he wrote it when Italy was broken because there were so many people who had invaded. The countryside was in shambles. Economy was taking a crap. So basically, he wrote it to say, this is how you need to rule. And if you rule this way, Italy will have the splendor it once had. And it did help. It helped them defend themselves when they were invaded again. Basically, what Machiavelli said was, and remember, right here, I'm going to try to hammer this into your brain. This is one of the most important quotes you will hear. This is probably the first important quote, but one of the most important quotes you will hear in AP Euro. He said, a prince should combine the cunning of a fox with the ferocity of a lion. So again, fierce like a lion, cunning like a fox. Remember that. That will basically apply to almost every ruler throughout European history because everyone read this book. He based all of his writing on Caesar Borgia, who was a good friend of his. He was a prince. He was the son of the Pope. And this guy was ruthless. This guy made the Signori look nice. He was always at war, constantly fighting. On New Year's Eve, after his generals had helped him pacify this entire region, always shown their respect to him, he had them all killed. Why did he have them killed? Just to prove that he could, because he was basically an asshole. But anyway, so Caesar Borgia epitomized the prince, and this book is extremely important. You have to remember it. The Prince by Machiavelli. The term Machiavellian, you might have heard that before. It now means corrupt, it means cruel, it means devious. So remember that. It might help you out in an English essay. It's pretty good. So, what helped them develop all this writing at the time? One of the things that really helped them out was the Gutenberg System. You might have heard of the Gutenberg Bible. Now, this was invented in Germany. I know we're kind of getting out of Italy right now. Really scary, really exciting. It's basically the first printing press. Before, you had a little monk sitting in a dark room by candlelight, writing on a page, and it would take years to write because, of course, they had to have the most perfect writing in the world. The Gutenberg system, they could print in mass, and so this was helping them print books, but more importantly, it was helping them print propaganda, it was helping them print religious work and political work. So it really helped to change the politics of the era because ideas could spread more quickly, and it was easier for the working class and the poor people to learn how to read and to receive information, because before they didn't have the money to purchase something that a monk had worked on for years of his life, and now they could buy this for much cheaper than they ever had before. So the Gutenberg Bible was one of the most important inventions of the time. Now we're going to move into a little bit talking about the people that, of course, you never hear about, the women. I know that sounds bad, but it's true. The women are sort of, at least for the first half of European history, are sort of persona non grata. They're nowhere because nobody really cared about them. But I'll tell you right now, and this is just experience from AP testing, expect a question, at least one question on an essay, to be about women or to be about some minority group, the peasants, somebody who's always downtrodden, because the AP test loves you to write really sad essays about these people who never had any rights. Anyway, strangely enough, while the status of men and artists was ascending, the status of women was declining. They lost a lot of their power that they had in the medieval times. However, their education was much better. They were learning basically the same stuff that the men were learning. But here's the catch. They were not allowed to use this learning in professions, because a woman with a profession, that was just unheard of. That was like a crime. So instead, they were expected to use everything that they learned just to entertain their husbands' friends. so that, their husband's friend would go home and say, oh, she was very well learned. That's basically what they wanted them to do. They had to be a gracious hostess. They had to make good conversation. And more than anything, they could not sleep around. If a woman was sleeping around, she'd get in big trouble. If a guy was sleeping around, that was a good thing. He was allowed to have affairs. But a woman, no. And one of the more bizarre bits of law during this time was that rape was not a serious crime because women were not seen as people, they were seen as property. So a younger girl would be property of her father, and an older woman would be property of her husband. If a woman was raped, the crime was not for violating a person, it was for damaging property. And so the punishment would be similar to if the guy had broken the woman's husband's wagon, something like that, Which isn't to say the punishment was light. No punishment at the time was light. I mean, for a crime like that, you'd have your genitals beaten off, which I know sounds disgusting, but that's the Renaissance for you. All right, now we're going to move into where the Renaissance starts to change a little bit. Before, we've been talking about Italy. We've been talking about Florence in particular. Florence goes through some hard times pretty soon. Around 1500, the Medicis are booted out. They're too secular, they're not religious enough, we're drifting away from the Christian ideals. And this guy, Savonarola, who's a psychopath, comes to power. He's a priest, seems like a pretty good guy, seems like he's going to bring back their morals. Turns out to be completely out of his mind. He burns all of these Da Vinci, Michelangelo paintings, priceless paintings, has them destroyed because they're too secular, kills all of these artists, kills all of these merchants who are secular. Basically, the guy is out of his mind. Eventually, the people think that, hey, this sucks. We want to go back to the old days where, we can have art, we can glorify ourselves, and we don't have to be boring religious people. So they come up and kill him. But while this is going on, the artists say, I'm not going there. Why would I go to Florence where this crazy guy is making all the people hate me and burning all my work? So they all move north. They all go to Rome. And this is what we call the High Renaissance, where the Renaissance shifts from Florence to Rome. And when it's in Rome, the Renaissance becomes more Christian. There's, the painting of the Sistine Chapel. There's all this religious work done because the main patron of the arts is the Pope. But that's not to say that Italy was the only place where the Renaissance was going on. Eventually, in the last part of the 15th century, the Low Countries, which are Belgium and the Netherlands, begin to sort of catch on, and they realize, hey, this is a pretty good idea. Let's drop out of the Middle Ages. Middle Ages suck. And so they go down to Italy, they learn all these new skills, and they take them back up north with them. They have a little different twist on humanism and on the other ideas of the Renaissance. They don't think humanism should be just the study of classics to better your role in society, to better society. They think that humanism should revolve around Christianity more, and that we should study these old works in order to better understand God and to better understand the Bible. It's called Christian humanism. So you'll notice a lot of the paintings of the time, while in Italy they may have been more portraits, paintings from Greek mythology, when you look at Northern European paintings, they're almost exclusively biblical. They're paintings of Jesus on the cross, of the Virgin Mary, etc. They began to reject the ideas of the Middle Ages that you had to follow everything the Bible said, you had to follow everything that Christianity says, because they knew we can convince ourselves that these things are true through reason. And they learned this reason through humanism, through the Italian humanism that they learned. They stressed education more than anything. They believed if we educate people, we can make them better. Because at the time, people were not so great. They were stupid, they were smelly, they never bathed, of course. You'll notice that too. People don't bathe in European history. You'll learn people like Louis XVI, you'll learn about later, took one bath in his entire life. So, just, an interesting side note. People don't bathe, so imagine how much that would stink. But anyway, these people are stupid. All they believe are the things that the church tells them. And the Christian humanists believe if we teach them, we will make their lives so much better. And that is why the Northern Renaissance is a lot less secular. It's less about decadence. It's less about let's have paintings of ourselves. Let's write little books that show how perfect we are. It's more thinking ahead and thinking about making a better society. And that's what probably one of the most famous humanists of this time was Erasmus, who was Dutch. He wrote the book Praise of Folly. And he's the prince of Christian humanism. That's his nickname. He basically wanted to see reforms in the Catholic Church. He wanted to use education, and he believed in the philosophy of Christ, which was that Christianity is an inner attitude or spirit, not formal laws. He didn't believe that the Bible constituted Christianity necessarily. Of course, he believed everything that the Bible said, but he thought that it had to be in your spirit too. You couldn't just believe because you read a book. You had to have it deep inside of you. And Erasmus, incidentally, may not have been so great. He also had syphilis, which is a venereal disease. But his writing was good, and he pushed for reforms. And you'll see Erasmus had huge impacts on the future, especially in our next chapter when we talk about the Protestant Reformation. Even though he was a Catholic, he really pushed to change the Catholic Church. Now, the other writer that you should know from the North is Thomas More. He was from England. The ideas eventually did spread to England and to Scandinavia, Germany, France, mostly through the armies that were poning Italy in the face during this time. He wrote this book called Utopia that you might have heard of. And Utopia, incidentally, is a Greek word for nowhere, because the place that he wrote about does not exist anywhere. But in his book, it's the perfect world. These people are very religious, but they also use lots of reason. They don't covet. They aren't extremely secular. And there's no war. There's no poverty. All religions are accepted. It was truly a revolutionary book. And he believed mainly, this is the main thing you need to remember about Thomas More, people are selfish because of all the material please excuse me, my tongue is tied, possessions that they owned. So if you own, 50 paintings, it makes you more of a jerk. Basically, that's what Thomas More believed. Finally, we're going to talk about the politics of the rest of Europe at this time, because they were pretty significant. They were quite a change from what was going on in the medieval ages. The rulers were, even though they had never read The Prince, because that idea had not gotten up to Northern Europe yet, they were starting to be pretty aggressive towards their nobles, towards their people. They wanted more power. And so they didn't really care about morals. They didn't care if they were hurting people. They didn't care if they were ruthless and cruel. As long as they got more power and they were able to have more control over their people, they didn't really care. And this is the first time you're going to hear about this, curbing the power of the nobles. Basically, you're going to hear that term in every chapter until the 19th century. Every king does that. And this is the first time it was ever done. Before this, the nobles were allowed to just run wild and do whatever the hell they wanted. Now the kings are saying, no, you have to help us. You have to be on our side. You can't just go off there and form your own little countries. During this time, there was this group called the New Monarchs. There were 3 countries that had new monarchs. There was England, who had Henry VII. There was France, who had Louis XI, also known as the Spider King because he was so ruthless and treacherous. And then there was Spain, who of course had the famous Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, they were called the New Monarchs because they had this strong royal authority that had been absent in most monarchs before. Most of the old monarchs basically just said, all right, nobles, do whatever you want as long as you keep order. These new monarchs said, we're not going to do that anymore. We have the divine right. We were given our power by God, and so we're not going to let you rule our land. And so they rose to power, curbed the power of the nobles, suppressed all opposition, and they basically believed, if this makes me happy, then it should be law. Let's take a moment to talk about each one of these real nice guys. Louis XI of France, Spider King, because he was such a bad guy. He was like a spider. Just sneak up on his enemies and destroy them. However, you have to give the guy the credit. He ended feudal disorder, where all the nobles were fighting each other in France. He promoted new industries, and probably most importantly, he brought in foreign craftsmen. He brought in these foreigners because he knew they were talented and he knew they'd bring wealth to his country. Also, significantly, he raised taxes and he used his commerce to build up the army. Before this time, countries really didn't have armies. What they do is, when they got into a war, they would go out, round up all the peasants, round up all the workers, and they'd say, well, here's a sword, go off and fight. Now they're actually starting to have these organized armies, and this is a huge step for Europe. A huge step if they want to kill each other, that is. He also set the stage for French absolutism, which we're going to talk about when we get to Louis XIV, the greatest absolutism ruler of all time. Another really important thing that he did was he relied almost exclusively on the middle class. The middle class were basically the people like those merchants that we talked about earlier in Florence. That was a new class. There was no middle class until the Renaissance. Before the Renaissance, there were the nobles, and then there was everybody else. And everybody else pretty much meant the peasants who were out working the fields. Now you have the artisans, you have the merchants, and these are the people that Louis XI is asking to help him build up his empire and to defeat these nobles who are trying to throw him out. England had a terrible civil war right before this time period, called the War of the Roses. Not nearly as nice as it sounds. It was between these two royal families, York and Lancaster. It pretty much destroyed the country. They were fighting for years and tore the country apart. Henry VII finally came to power. He was the first Tudor, and he basically said, you know what? No more fighting, no more nobility even. I'm going to crush you guys and set up this sort of absolutist monarchy. He had this court they called the Star Chamber, and the Star Chamber was a pretty horrific place. That was where he brought all of his nobles who refused to bow down to him, and basically they were tortured again and again until finally they gave up and, well, they either died or they bowed down to Henry VII as their ruler. Most of them, gave up pretty quickly, considering the horrific torture devices that they had at the time. Of course, there were the things that everyone knows about, the rack, lie down on a bed and have your arms and legs tied and slowly cranked until they were ripped out of their sockets. They also had, probably the worst in my view, was the Judas Pyramid. Really nasty thing. Basically, it was a pyramid made out of metal. They'd have you sit on it, naked. They'd tie weights around your arms and legs, and then you would slowly have more and more weight added to your arms and legs until you were slowly impaled on this pyramid. Pretty nasty stuff. And then there were always the funny ones, like where they'd take you, put you in the stocks, which were like those wooden things that hold you down, and then they'd cover your feet in salt and just have a goat lick your feet until you were screaming for mercy. Sounds funny, but it'd probably be pretty painful. Uh, again, this guy, smart guy, relied on the middle class. They were his royal council, and he also encouraged the cloth industry. And of course, everybody knows about Ferdinand and Isabella. What you probably don't know is that Spain was like Italy before Ferdinand and Isabella. It was torn apart. All these city-states, they were always fighting back and forth. Finally, Ferdinand and Isabella got married, and with their marriage, they brought peace because they were from two of the enemy city-states, basically. They were pretty good in the sense that they really broadened cultural activity, intellectual activity. They were the ones who, of course, funded Christopher Columbus on his journey to America in 1492. One little thing that was kind of bad about Ferdinand and Isabella was the Inquisition. The Inquisition was pretty horrible. It was not funny like the Monty Python clip with the Spanish Inquisition. Instead, it was where basically every Jew and Arab in Spain was killed or forced to convert. And then the saddest thing was these poor people had been forced to convert. They thought, oh, I'm safe now. My kids are safe now. I don't really care if I say I'm a Christian. I'm still a Jew or I'm still an Arab. I'm still Muslim. Then the Spaniards kind of caught on to this. They came back. They went to all these people and said, you're not really Christian, are you? People couldn't say no. So where do you think they go? They go and they get them on the rack. So they're tortured, told to confess. Most of them don't confess because, they don't want to give up their honor. And so they're burned at the stake. And that's the Spanish Inquisition for you. And that dominated most of Ferdinand and Isabella's monarchy. Finally, at the end here, I would like to spend a minute just talking about some of the most famous artists of the time, some of the most famous architects and writers. We already talked about Castiglione, Machiavelli, but I'd like to just touch on some of these famous artists, just in case they come up on the test. Of course, there's Michelangelo. He's one of the most famous. This is the guy he sculpted David, was one of his most famous works. He also painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which was unfortunate for him. Helped out his reputation a lot, but it wasn't so great because all the poison dyes that he used to paint the ceiling dripped down onto his eyeballs when he was painting on his back, and he soon went blind, so he wasn't able to do any work after that. But Sistine Chapel remains probably his greatest work. There was also Leonardo Da Vinci, of course, who painted the Mona Lisa. Leonardo da Vinci was also a great inventor. The guy invented the helicopter. He also invented the parachute before there was anything that could fly. So there was no point in having a parachute, but he invented one anyway. The guy was brilliant. There was also Raphael, who was Michelangelo's rival. This guy, they told him they wanted him to paint the Sistine Chapel, and then they came to him later and said, we kind of like Michelangelo better. So Raphael is not quite as famous, but he did paint the School of Athens, which, look for it, it will probably be on your test, or at least on one of your tests in the class. And the School of Athens is a really famous painting because it really shows, almost more than any other painting at the time, the extent of humanism in the society. You see Socrates, Aristotle, all these famous philosophers from ancient Greece and in the background of this painting. So it's really important in that sense. From the north, really the only guy you really need to know is Bruegel. And he was from the Netherlands, and he's famous for his paintings of peasants. So he was really one of the first guys to go out into the fields, paint the peasants, show their daily lives. Very realistic, not like the paintings of the medieval ages. Finally, at the very end, I said women are very important, so I need to discuss women just for one more minute. We're almost done. Women at the time, I said that they were unable to participate in most major professions. The only way they could continue their learning would be to give up on marriage, not get married, and to instead join a convent, become a nun. Because nuns were allowed to study. They were allowed to continue their education. There were basically three roles a woman could take. She could be a nun, where she got to study but not get married. She could get married to a wealthy man, basically be that man's slave for her entire life. The final option was more rare, but it was an option. She could become a courtesan. Courtesan is basically a fancy Renaissance term for a hoe. Courtesans were very wealthy, high-paid prostitutes in in Renaissance Italy. And they had a lot of freedom. They could study if they wanted to, but at the same time, it was a little dangerous because when the people suddenly decided to have these outbursts of Christianity, who do you think the first people they went after were? The courtesans, the people who were corrupting the men in the society, the people who were witches, if you will. And that's basically it. That's basically the Renaissance in a nutshell. Good luck on your test. It's coming up. Hopefully you're listening to this to review. And I have to apologize for this boring chapter. Don't worry. We got one more boring chapter, Protestant Reformation. Basically, it's terrible. It's so boring. But after that, good news is the next chapter is called The Religious Wars. And so, I mean, nothing can be boring that has war in it, right? So The Religious Wars is a really exciting chapter. A lot of fun. I hope that you all keep listening because we're going to have a good time. All right. Well, again, good luck on your test, and you'll be hearing from me in a few weeks. All right. Bye.